Hi, my name's Leonie West. Today I'm going to talk to you about the importance of a scant quarter-inch seam allowance. On this piece here we have a seam allowance which is in cream. That is a scant quarter-inch seam allowance. The black is a quarter-inch seam allowance. The difference is 2 threads. You may wonder why such a small amount makes such a difference to your quilting. I have cut 2 9-patch blocks. Finish measurement will be 6 inches. The pieces were all cut at the same time. The difference is this block has been sewn with a scant quarter-inch seam allowance. As you can see, my half square triangles are square and measure 2.5 inches, and my quarter square triangle measures 2.5 inches. This block I have sewn with a quarter-inch seam allowance. You can see that my half square triangle is smaller than the 2.5-inch unit, and my quarter-inch triangle is much smaller. The more seams we add into our block, the more this difference between a scant quarter-inch and a quarter-inch makes. This is the block sewn with a scant quarter-inch seam allowance. Now that I have sewn the units into rows, you can see that my block, when I sew the rows together, is going to line up beautifully. I'm going to be able to nest my seams and get lovely intersections. The points of my triangles will still be in the correct position. This is the block that was sewn with a quarter-inch seam allowance. As you can see, this unit does not measure the same as the 2.5-inch square. My quarter square unit is much smaller than my 2.5 inches. When I go to sew these rows together, I will not be able to match my seams. This is the block that has been sewn with a scant quarter-inch seam allowance. As you can see, the points of my quarter square triangle are still in place. I have nested the seams. I'm going to flip it over, and I have spun my seam intersections to give me a flatter centre, to give me flatter intersections here. That makes it easier to quilt. This block here is the one that has been sewn with the quarter-inch seam allowance. I've nested the seam in here, and as you can see, it is not the same measurement here. Over here, the seam is slightly off. I've lost my point here. I've lost a lot of point here, a bit of point here. I've lost the point here. My seam doesn't meet here, doesn't meet here, here, or here. This should be a nice straight row across here. I'm dropping in here. This one is straight across. This one is out of place. If I flip this one over, you can see how little seam allowance I now have on this piece. Because my piece became smaller using the quarter-inch seam allowance, I have lost all this seam allowance. This will make my quilt quite unstable. I only have a couple of threads holding that fabric together. We really need our seam allowances to keep our quilts looking good and to make them last for years. So that is the reason why I use a scant quarter-inch seam allowance rather than a quarter-inch seam allowance. If you are unsure about the seam allowance you are sewing with, cut 2 2.5-inch squares, sew them together, press them. They should measure 4.5 inches, so you should be able to sew your pieced unit to your 4.5-inch rectangle. If you do not have a finished piece measuring 4.5 inches, then you need to adjust your seam allowance. You can do this by moving the needle so that you make your seam allowance narrower. Generally, this movement is done by moving the needle to the right.